Winter storms in my grandparents' village would descend without warning, bringing darkness so complete it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. The power lines couldn't withstand the weight of ice and wind, and so my grandfather would move through the house lighting oil lamps with practiced hands, their soft glow pushing back against shadows that seemed to breathe in the corners. My grandmother would retire early on these nights, her footsteps creaking up the wooden stairs, while my grandfather and I remained in the warm circle of lamplight, playing cards until the numbers blurred together and sleep pulled at my eyelids. That particular night, he yawned around 10 o'clock and announced his intention to sleep, reminding me that my parents would arrive early the next morning to collect me. I promised not to stay up too late, though I felt wide awake, energized by the solitude and the dancing shadows cast by the lamp flames. After he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, I continued playing solitaire, arranging and rearranging the worn cards, enjoying the silence that pressed against the windows like something alive. The sound began as a single thud on the roof directly above me. It was heavy, deliberate, followed by a dragging noise that scraped across the tiles from one end of the house to the other, then back again in a methodical pattern that felt purposeful, intelligent. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was snow falling from the overhanging tree branches, or perhaps a raccoon dog exploring the rooftop. Anything but what my instincts were screaming it might be. The walking stopped directly overhead, and in that moment of silence, I felt the weight of something's attention bearing down on me. Then came a scraping noise, like fingernails or claws attempting to dig through the roof tiles to peel back the barrier between us. I extinguished the lamp with trembling hands and sat in absolute darkness, my breath shallow and rapid, every muscle tensed. After what felt like hours but was likely only a minute, the scraping ceased. I began to exhale, to tell myself it was over, that I had imagined the worst of it. Then a voice emerged from directly behind me, so close I could feel the displacement of air as it spoke. "Why did you extinguish the light? Don't you want to see my face?" The scream tore from my throat before conscious thought could form. I leapt away from my sitting position, spinning to face the source of the voice, my heart hammering so violently I thought my ribs might crack. In the darkness, I could just make out a towering figure standing where no one had been moments before. Its proportions were wrong, all wrong, too tall and too angular to be human. I backed toward the door, my hands fumbling behind me for the handle, my eyes unable to look away from the shape that had materialized in my grandparents' home. The figure stepped forward into a narrow shaft of moonlight penetrating the window. What I saw in that pale illumination will live behind my eyelids for the rest of my days. Its skin was the deep crimson of blood left to congeal and darken, wrinkled like ancient leather, yet stretched impossibly tight over a skull that belonged to no creature I had ever seen or imagined. A single horn protruded from its head, not smooth like a rhinoceros, but twisted and gnarled like blackened wood that had been struck by lightning and left to char. Its mouth split its face nearly from ear to ear, filled with teeth that resembled shards of broken pottery, each one jagged and irregular. The eyes were entirely black, twin voids that somehow reflected the moonlight like polished stones at the bottom of a well. It gripped what appeared to be a club or hammer, but the shape refused to remain constant when I tried to focus on it, shifting and writhing as though it existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The creature spoke again, its voice like grinding stones and breaking branches. "You took from me, now I will take from you." It reached toward me with its free hand, and I saw that it had too many fingers, each one grotesquely elongated, bending in places where joints should not exist. I don't remember opening the door. I don't remember running into the forest in only my socks, my coat forgotten in my terror, the winter cold biting into my exposed skin. My memories of that flight are fragmentary, disconnected, like scenes from a film with crucial frames missing. I remember my lungs burning, the taste of copper in my mouth, falling multiple times on the frozen ground and scrambling back to my feet without pausing. Somehow, through instinct or providence or pure animal panic, I found myself collapsed before the village shrine, the same stone altar I had desecrated days earlier when I thought myself bold and untouchable. I was crying and praying, promising anything and everything if only the thing pursuing me would leave me alone, if only I could survive this night. A hand fell on my shoulder, and I screamed again, certain I had been caught. But it was my grandfather's weathered hand, his grip firm and grounding. He had followed my tracks in the snow, my panicked footprints telling him everything he needed to know. His face was grim, carved from shadows and worry, and he helped me to my feet with a gentleness that made me sob harder. "Did it touch you?" he asked, his voice urgent. I shook my head, unable to form words through my tears. "Then you can still leave," he said, and there was something final in his tone, something that spoke of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. He refused to let me return to their house. We walked instead to the neighbor's home, where I spent the remainder of the night huddled under blankets that couldn't stop my shivering, jumping at every sound that penetrated the walls. My grandfather returned to pack my belongings alone, and I have never asked him what he encountered in that house during his solitary vigil. When my parents arrived the next morning, I was frantic to leave, barely able to sit still in the car. My grandfather spoke to them privately while I waited, and I watched the tree line through the window, certain I would see that crimson figure emerge to claim me after all. I never told my parents the complete truth, convincing myself they would dismiss it as a nightmare or homesickness or the overactive imagination of a child. I never returned to that village. My grandparents have long since passed, and the house was sold to strangers who know nothing of what walks in those woods on certain nights. But I still dream of it, of the creature and its too wide smile and its impossible fingers reaching for me. In my dreams, I never escape. In my dreams, I am still running through those frozen woods, and I will be running forever. Weston and I had been friends since sophomore year of high school, bonded by terrible music taste and even worse fashion choices, a friendship that somehow survived the transition into our 20s when so many others fell away. By the time this happened, I was 24, working at a brewery in Atlanta and barely scraping by on tips and irregular hours. Wes was 26, doing freelance graphic design between what he called real jobs, living in the same state of perpetual, almost success that defined our generation. That spring had been brutal for me. My girlfriend of 3 years had moved out in February, taking half the furniture and leaving me with an apartment I couldn't afford, and an emptiness that made every room feel haunted by her absence. Work was deteriorating too, with demanding customers and a manager who seemed to take personal pleasure in criticizing everything I did. When Wes suggested a weekend hiking trip, I agreed immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to reset, to step away from the wreckage of my life and find some kind of clarity in the wilderness. Neither of us were particularly outdoorsy. We had grown up in Marietta subdivisions where nature meant the narrow strips of trees between housing developments, decorative rather than functional. But that was part of the appeal. This would be completely different, a place where our phones might not work and the reminders of my ex-girlfriend couldn't reach me. We chose Black Rock Mountain State Park, only a 2-hour drive and allegedly featuring spectacular views. The main trails were pleasant enough, well-marked and moderate in difficulty, but by mid-afternoon, Wes was growing bored with what he called the tourist experience. He pointed out a barely visible game trail veering into denser forest, suggesting we see where it led. I should have refused, should have recognized the moment when we could still turn back. But the entire point of this trip was to do something different, to step outside the comfortable boundaries of our ordinary lives. After 40 minutes of pushing through brush and climbing over fallen trees, we emerged into a small clearing dominated by an old fire tower, probably from the 50s or 60s based on its construction. It stood about 60 feet tall, a precarious mixture of metal and wood listing slightly to one side, with a faded sign warning people not to climb. Wes's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that should have worried me more than it did. "We have to camp up there tonight," he said. "Imagine the sunrise view. Nobody else has posted this one on Instagram yet. It's authentic." The climb took 20 minutes, testing each step before committing our full weight, the entire structure swaying gently in the wind. At the top was an observation platform, maybe 15 feet square, with a small enclosed cabin missing its door and half its windows. We set up our sleeping bags on the open platform rather than in the cabin, which was filled with beer cans and graffiti, evidence that we weren't the first to ignore the warning signs. But Wes was right about the view. Miles of blue-green mountains rolled away in every direction, and as the sun descended, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, it felt good to be away from everything, to exist in this temporary space where my failures didn't matter. Around us, comfortable conversation about nothing important. Then Wes mentioned that there were stories about this tower, tales he'd heard from someone at the gear store, a park worker who killed himself up here in the 70s, or a little girl who got lost and died in the woods, depending on who was telling the story. I dismissed it as the kind of ghost story that attaches itself to every abandoned place, and Wes agreed it was probably nonsense. "If we get murdered by ghosts tonight, at least we'll die with a good view," he said, taking another swig of whiskey. By midnight, we were both properly drunk and exhausted. We crawled into our sleeping bags under a sky packed with more stars than I'd ever seen, the tower creaking gently in the wind. I was too tired to care about the groaning metal, and the whiskey had smoothed the edges of my anxiety. Actually, it was peaceful. I woke suddenly to the unmistakable sensation of being watched. When I opened my eyes, a small girl was standing over me, maybe 2 feet from my face. She looked 7 or 8 years old, wearing an old-fashioned dress with a pattern I couldn't make out in the darkness. Her hair was wet, clinging to her pale face in matted clumps, and she was simply staring, motionless and silent. I blinked hard, telling myself I was dreaming or still drunk from the whiskey and Wes's ghost stories. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself it had been a nightmare and rolled over to sleep. The second time I woke, she was sitting on my chest, her face inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating from her skin like she was made of ice rather than flesh. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, lacking any shine or moisture, dead eyes that stared into mine with an intensity that froze me in place. Water dripped from her hair onto my sleeping bag and face, each drop shockingly cold. I could see her dress now, a faded blue thing with small flowers, the kind no child had worn in decades. I gasped, and she vanished instantly, like someone had switched off a projector. I sat up, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. It read 2:17 in the morning. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. I tried to wake Wes, shaking him hard, but he just mumbled and rolled away, unnaturally difficult to rouse. When I looked around, I noticed my belongings had been moved. My backpack, which I'd left zipped near the stairs, was now in the center of the platform with its contents scattered, as though someone had dumped it out and pawed through everything. I heard soft footsteps then, accompanied by quiet humming that wasn't quite a tune, just disconnected notes that made my skin crawl. I turned on my phone's light and swept it around the platform, but saw nothing. As I turned it off, I caught a glimpse of the girl in my peripheral vision, standing in the cabin doorway. When I whipped my head around to look directly, she was gone. This happened 3 more times, each appearance building my terror higher. She would materialize somewhere in the corner of my vision, always staring, always silent, vanishing the moment I tried to look at her directly. Small, wet footprints appeared on the wooden platform, circling our sleeping bags, sometimes stopping right beside my head. By now, I was sitting fully upright, my back against the railing, knife in hand, though I had no idea how useful it would be against something that didn't seem entirely physical. The temperature kept dropping until it felt like winter had arrived in the middle of spring. Around 3 in the morning, she appeared again at the foot of our sleeping bags. A puddle of water surrounded her bare feet, and her dress looked even wetter than before. She stared at me with those dead eyes, then slowly raised her arm, pointing down through the platform. I didn't move, couldn't move. She kept pointing insistently, her expression never changing, then tilted her head at an angle that was physically impossible, nearly sideways on her shoulders. What happened next shattered whatever rational explanation I had been clinging to. She dropped to all fours and began crawling toward us, her joints bent wrong, arms and legs articulating in ways human limbs shouldn't, her head twisted at that impossible angle. She moved like something that had studied human movement but couldn't quite replicate it, something fundamentally other trying to imitate being a child. She reached the edge of my sleeping bag, then impossibly began crawling up the cabin wall. Wes finally woke, sitting up disoriented, mumbling a question. Then he saw where I was staring. The girl was on the ceiling now, looking down at us, her wet hair hanging toward the floor in defiance of gravity. She opened her mouth impossibly wide, and no sound emerged, just that yawning darkness in her face. I screamed at Wes to run. We abandoned most of our gear, grabbing only phones and car keys, practically falling down those stairs in our panic. We spent the rest of the night hiking back through the woods, getting lost repeatedly, jumping at every sound. By dawn, we reached the car and drove away, eventually laughing like maniacs as the adrenaline drained away, and we realized we had survived. I have lived in my house for decades, and for as long as I can remember, the building next door was an abandoned funeral home. A decaying structure with splintered wood and shattered windows, it stood as a monument to neglect, a place that looked haunted even in daylight. About a year ago, that changed. Vans began arriving at all hours, renovation crews transforming the crumbling edifice into something restored and polished. Within months, a new sign appeared on the lawn announcing Lucian Funeral Home, ready for business. At first, I wasn't thrilled about living next to a functioning funeral home, but I told myself it was better than the rotting eyesore it had been. For a while, it seemed normal, almost pleasant. I could never have imagined that the beautiful, polished version would terrify me more than the abandoned one ever did. Now I pray every night that it shuts down, that the people running it pack up and leave, that the building collapses into an empty lot. The only unsettling aspect initially was watching them bring in the bodies. My back porch faces the side of the funeral home where they unload, and they only do it at night. Sometimes when I step outside for a smoke, I see the hearse backing up to the elevated double doors. As it approaches, the doors swing open, and a man reaches out to pull the stretcher inside on some kind of rail system. It's morbid, but how can you not look? One night, after a particularly stressful day, I stepped outside for a second cigarette, much later than usual. It was brutally cold, but I bundled up and took my usual spot. I wasn't looking at the funeral home, instead scanning the tree line for the small rabbit that sometimes appears. Then, without warning, the entire backyard exploded with light. Floodlights from the funeral home blazed to life, bright as midday, and I squinted toward the building. A figure emerged from the back door, the same man who usually unloaded the bodies, but this time he was dragging something wrapped in a white sheet. I watched, frozen, as he trudged across the lawn, tugging the sheet-covered bundle behind him. He stopped halfway between the building and the tree line, dropped it, and simply walked back inside. What had I just witnessed? The questions flooded my mind. Why was he out so late? What was under that sheet? Why had he left it there? I stepped toward the edge of the porch, trying to make out details. The sheet flapped in the breeze, revealing nothing. Whatever was inside was small but heavy based on the way he dragged it. Then the lights cut off, plunging everything into darkness. A long moment passed. I flicked my cigarette into the grass and turned toward my door. The floodlights roared back to life, and when I turned around, the yard was empty. The sheet-covered bundle was gone. From that night forward, it became a pattern. Once a week, always on Sundays, the man would emerge in the dead of night, drag something wrapped in a sheet to the same spot, turn off the lights, and when they came back on, the sheet would be gone. Every Monday morning, just after dawn, he would walk into the woods carrying an empty black trash bag. Minutes later, he would return with the bag full. Curiosity turned to paranoia. Something wrong was happening, something I needed to understand. So I made a plan. Next Sunday, when he brought that sheet into the yard and shut off the lights, I would be waiting. I would see what was taking it. Sunday night came. I waited in my shed, hidden in the shadows, the cold making my fingers numb even with gloves. I'd been out there for hours, chain smoking, my nerves rattling. Just as I started to doubt it would happen, slivers of light sliced through the shed's walls. I pressed my face to the wooden slats and peered through. There he was, dragging that same sheet-wrapped shape. As he disappeared back inside, the floodlights cut out. This was it. Now or never. I burst from the shed and raced across the lawn, pressing my back against the funeral home's wall. I peered into the backyard, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The pale outline of the sheet-wrapped object lay in the grass, motionless and silent. Then something shifted near it. Dark shapes, low to the ground, barely taller than the bundle. They had no distinct features, just shifting silhouettes, circling like vultures. For several long seconds they moved silently, then blurred together into a single writhing shadow. Then, nothing. The shapes disappeared. The floodlights blazed back to life, and I flinched. When my vision cleared, the yard was empty. The sheet was gone. Confusion twisted into fear, then nausea. I sprinted back to my house and slammed the door, locking it with shaking fingers. I paced the living room, occasionally peeking through the blinds, hoping to see something that could explain what I'd witnessed. The next morning, loud knocking woke me. Through the side window, I saw him, the man from the funeral home. My breath caught. What should I do? I couldn't ignore him after he'd seen me looking. Did he see me last night? No, it was too dark. He was already inside when I ran over. I forced myself to stay calm and opened the door, trying to appear casual. He gave me a friendly smile and explained he worked next door. They'd had a trespasser last night, caught on their side camera, someone who'd come from my side of the property. He was wondering if I'd seen anything, since I sit on my porch at night to smoke. I told him I hadn't noticed anyone, that it was quiet as always. His smile faded, and he studied my face for a long, uncomfortable moment. Eventually, he said he'd figured as much, but wanted to ask anyway. His eyes flicked past me, scanning my home. I shifted, blocking more of the doorway. I suggested he call the cops, that maybe someone else in the area had noticed something. His gaze snapped back to me, and his smile returned, wider this time. "No need for that," he said smoothly. "I prefer to handle things in-house, if you know what I mean." He let the words hang between us, before adding that if I did see anything, I should let him know. "Funeral homes are no place for prying," he said, still smiling. The meaning was clear. He turned and walked off without excusing himself. I shut the door and locked it, knowing exactly what he'd been trying to do. Intimidate me, scare me into minding my business. But it had the opposite effect. Now I needed to know. Without wasting time, I decided to go into the woods. It was still early. Maybe he hadn't been out there yet. I pulled on my boots and stepped into the tree line bordering our properties. The forest was easy to navigate with most of the undergrowth dead, and I soon noticed faint drag marks in the leaves, disturbed as though something heavy had been pulled through. I followed the trail, losing and picking it back up, until it led me to a small clearing. At the edge stood old rotting bleachers, blue paint curling away in strips. The drag marks continued beneath them. I crouched down and peered into the shadows. There it was, a wide sheet, torn to shreds and soaked in blood, tangled with ripped pieces of plastic, also stained red. The ground was dark and damp, disturbed violently. My mind reeled at the scene. Then I noticed tiny, bloody handprints smeared across the fabric. And surrounding the sheet, imprinted in the blood-soaked earth, were small footprints, dozens of them, no bigger than a toddler's. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps. Someone was coming. I bolted from the clearing and ducked behind a tree, pressing my back against the bark, holding my breath. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped briefly before resuming. I risked a glance. It was him, the funeral home man, walking into the clearing with a black trash bag in his hand. I snapped back behind cover, listening as he rustled around beneath the bleachers. Then his footsteps retreated. I waited 20 minutes before moving, checking over my shoulder constantly. When I finally approached the bleachers again and looked underneath, everything was gone. The sheet, the plastic, every trace of the scene. Even the dirt had been disturbed and kicked around, hiding the blood and erasing the tiny footprints. It was as if nothing had been there at all. That was 3 or 4 months ago. Since then, I don't go outside much anymore, especially not at night. I avoid my porch and backyard, doing everything I can to pretend that cursed place doesn't exist. But it's getting harder to ignore, because ever since I stepped into those woods, I've started hearing things. Knocks on my walls, scratches at windows, footsteps on my roof. I don't know what's happening. I just know I live next to a funeral home that's been feeding something, and now I think I've made it angry. I've worked at my software company for almost 5 years, and every quarter, management organizes team-building retreats. Usually it's something simple, like renting a restaurant or visiting a local attraction, but last October, our department head, Vaughn, decided we should do something more authentic to really bond as a team. That's how 5 of us ended up camping in Zion National Park for what was supposed to be 3 nights. We only made it to 2. I'm not normally the type to believe in the supernatural. I'm a software developer. I deal with logic all day. But what happened in Zion, I can't explain it. Neither can Tessa or Minkson or Lyle or even Vaughn, who usually has an answer for everything. Our department had been under pressure for months, putting in 60-hour weeks, and Vaughn thought the retreat would let us blow off steam before the final push to launch. He'd been talking about Zion for weeks, how beautiful it was, how disconnecting from technology would reset our brains. We drove out early Thursday morning in 2 cars. The drive was pleasant, talking about normal things, complaining about work, sharing stories. By the time we reached the park entrance, I was feeling good about the trip. Zion is beautiful, those massive red cliffs rising against blue sky. Vaughn had reserved a group campsite near the Virgin River, and by late afternoon we had everything set up, 5 tents in a rough circle with a fire pit in the middle. Vaughn had sprung for fancy equipment, big waterproof tents and decent sleeping bags. That first evening was fun. We grilled burgers, drank a few beers, relaxed around the campfire. The stars were incredible, more than you ever see in the city. We retired from the drive and turned in early. I was just drifting off when I heard Minkson whispering outside my tent, asking if I was awake. He was crouched there with a flashlight, Tessa and Lyle giggling behind him. They had a dare for me. I groaned, asking if we were 12 years old, but eventually crawled out of my tent. Minkson wanted me to go into the woods past the tree line and say something 3 times. Yay eat so, he called it, claiming it was a Native American thing his roommate had told him about, something you shouldn't say in the wilderness. I asked why he didn't do it himself, and he smirked, saying he was daring me. Not wanting to be the guy who couldn't take a joke, I agreed. I took his flashlight and headed toward the trees. When I reached them, I hesitated, feeling uneasy, like maybe I shouldn't be doing this. But it was just syllables, right? I said it 3 times, my voice dropping into the darkness like a stone into still water. For a moment after I finished, the woods seemed even quieter than before. Then an owl hooted, and I jumped, hurrying back to where the others waited. I pulled out my phone and tried to Google the phrase, but I didn't know how to spell it and couldn't find anything. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed. It took a while to fall asleep. I kept hearing something moving outside my tent, but I told myself it was wind or some small animal. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to a scratching sound on my tent wall. Not like an animal trying to get in, more purposeful, like someone dragging their nails across the fabric. It came in sets of 3 scratches, then silence, then again on the other side of the tent. I called out, asking who was there, my voice embarrassingly shaky. No answer, just another set of scratches. I fumbled for my flashlight and phone. It was 3:17 in the morning. The scratching continued, and I aimed my light at the tent wall, seeing the fabric depress slightly with each scratch. I yelled louder, telling Minkson and Tessa to cut it out. The scratching stopped. After a few minutes of tense silence, I convinced myself it was one of them playing a prank and eventually fell back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and nearly stepped on something lying right outside the entrance. For a brief second, I thought someone had left a small red cloth. Then I realized what I was looking at and stumbled backward, yelling. It was a squirrel, or half of one. The animal had been cut cleanly across the middle. The front half, head and front paws, and part of the torso was placed neatly at my tent door, the fur still glossy, the small black eyes staring at nothing. Soon everyone was crowded around, looking at the discovery with disgust and fascination. Vaughn suggested it was a coyote, though he looked worried. Tessa thought maybe some hikers played a prank, but didn't sound convinced. I looked at Minkson, asking if they had done this as part of the dare. He held up his hands, insisting they wouldn't do something that messed up. I believed him. Vaughn used a stick to move the remains away from camp and bury them under rocks. When he came back, he tried to act normal, saying we had a big hike planned. I pulled him aside, suggesting we pack up and head back early. He frowned, asking if I was serious about leaving because of a dead squirrel. I told him about the scratching on my tent. He looked skeptical, saying it was probably wind or a curious raccoon. He refused to leave unless something else weird happened. The day's hike was along the Watchman Trail. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have enjoyed the incredible views, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We had been hiking about 3 hours when I heard it. My name, called from somewhere off to the east. It was faint but distinct. I stopped, causing Tessa to bump into me. She asked what was wrong, and I asked if she'd heard that. She hadn't heard anything. But then it came again, louder. Everyone heard it this time. We all stopped and looked toward the sound. Vaughn checked the map, saying there was no trail over there, just steep terrain leading to cliffs. The voice came again, somehow both distant and clear. Tessa suggested someone might need help. Minkson squinted in the direction, but didn't see anyone. I said we should check it out, though every instinct told me to do the opposite. Vaughn nodded reluctantly, insisting we stick together. We left the trail and headed east toward the voice that kept calling my name every minute or so. The well-maintained path quickly gave way to loose rocks and scrubby vegetation. My name came again, followed by, "This way." The voice seemed just ahead now, beyond a rise in the terrain. I sped up, pulling ahead of the others. Vaughn called from behind, telling me to wait and be careful. I crested the rise and stopped abruptly. In front of me, the ground dropped away suddenly, a sheer cliff face plunging at least 100 feet to jagged rocks below. The voice seemed to be coming from the empty air just beyond the edge. I took an instinctive step back as Minkson caught up, grabbing my arm and exclaiming about the drop. The others joined us, staring at the cliff edge with wide eyes. Tessa pointed out that the voice had sounded like it was coming from right here, but there was nothing. I heard my name again, and suddenly the voice sounded disappointed. Vaughn said we needed to get back to the trail immediately. No one argued. We hiked back mostly in silence. That evening, around the campfire, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Lyle suggested it was some kind of echo, that sound does strange things in canyons. Tessa asked why it would be saying my name. Minkson theorized it was saying something else that just sounded like my name. I told them about trying to Google the phrase the night before. Vaughn asked what the dare had been exactly, looking annoyed as the others explained. He said we were supposed to be respectful of local customs and beliefs. I asked if he knew what the phrase meant. He shook his head, but was cut off by a sudden whooshing sound from above. Something dark hurtled down from the night sky and landed with a sickening thud directly in the campfire, sending sparks and burning logs flying in all directions. We all leapt up, screaming and backing away. In the firelight, I could see what had fallen. It was a coyote, already dead before the fall, horrifically mutilated with long gashes across its body like it had been torn by something much larger. The smell of burning fur filled the air as the carcass began to smolder. Vaughn was the first to recover, frantically stomping out small fires that had started in the surrounding grass. He told everyone to grab essential gear immediately. We were heading back to the cars. Minson asked if he meant in the dark, and Vaughn snapped yes, unless we wanted to stay with that, pointing at the smoking coyote. No one argued. Within 10 minutes, we were ready to go. Vaughn instructed us to stay close together, no one wander off for any reason, stick to the main trail all the way to the parking lot. It was about 5 miles, a couple hours if we kept a good pace. The hike back was the most terrifying experience of my life. Our headlamps barely penetrated the darkness. We walked quickly, sometimes breaking into a jog when our nerves got the better of us. About halfway back, we all heard it. Something large moving parallel to us in the brush off the trail, not trying to hide its presence, breaking branches and rustling leaves. Sometimes it would stop when we stopped, but mostly it kept pace with us, always just out of sight. Vaughn yelled at us not to look when Lyle tried to shine his light toward the sounds, telling us to just keep moving. When we finally reached the parking lot, we practically ran to our cars. No one suggested going back for the rest of our gear. In my car, no one spoke for the first hour. Then Tessa said from the back seat that she'd looked it up. Yeitso is Navajo. It means skinwalker. She explained what that meant, a kind of witch that can transform into animals, evil things that can mimic human voices and lure people to their deaths. When we got back to the city, Vaughn called an emergency meeting with HR and the executive team. 2 days later, we all received an email stating that due to safety concerns, all future company retreats would be held in controlled environments only. There was also a line about respecting indigenous cultural beliefs and a link to corporate sensitivity training. The 5 of us don't talk about what happened. Not really. Sometimes at happy hour after a few drinks, one of us might say, "Remember Zion?" and the others will not. What is there to say? We can't explain it.